Professor.
Yes.
And we hope when we will return to former life, we will have opportunity to see you in Almaty.
No, that would be wonderful.
Now we have at this summer school 274 participants from 10 countries and from the 34 universities of the world. Okay, dear participant, can I ask you to put microphone on mute, please? And Professor, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
We couldn't hear you. Ануар, подключи.
Нет, слышно нормально, мне слышно.
Can you hear me?
Вам слышно, профессор? Окей, я отключаюсь тогда.
Hopefully my audio is coming through. Good. The topic of my talk today is looking at global food security and focusing a little bit on agricultural trade. We'll spend a little bit of time using Kazakhstan as an example. I will speak in English, and my slides will be in Russian, and so hopefully this will work well. In terms of looking at this first slide basically shows the population density changes from 1950 to 2020. And so this cartogram here basically gives a little bit of a picture of the world that many of us have lived in for a period of time. Certainly in terms of, you can see the importance of India, the importance of China, and in some respects, you can see the growing size and importance of Africa. And then in some respects, you can see the shrinking of the importance, at least in terms of population, with regards to Europe. I think the important thing to realize, and this is going to become very important as we move forward, is essentially looking at where world population is going to ultimately rest on the planet and where food products are produced. This next slide basically looks at the next 30 years, and so those of you that are younger, certainly this is the world that you will be working in. Probably the big thing that you notice is just the growing size and importance of Africa. Certainly China and India remain important in some of the countries around the Middle East, but essentially over the next 30 years. And then if you want to take it a little bit further, and again, these are all UN world population prospects. The United Nations uses models to estimate what the population will be as we move from 2050 to 2100. Again, you don't see much of a change in the trend. Africa continues to grow in importance, and in some respects, it's going to be a major player with regards to where we are. One of the things that also is important is essentially looking at where we are now. This figure here provides a little bit of an indication with regards to the hunger issue. For example, the dark red here basically indicates that more than 35% of the population is struggling with hunger. And then the lighter red is 25 to 35% of the population struggling from hunger. In terms of the orange, would be 15 to 25%. Then we move into the yellow here, and we see that there is 5 to 15%. The green would be less than 5%. And then the blue, where Kazakhstan is basically less than 2.5%. And so this is essentially the situation we're in now. If you look at Africa, in some respects, Africa is starting from a situation behind in terms of already they're struggling with undernourishment. And if we look at where population is expected to land, it's expected to land in this situation. And so in some respects, I think this is going to be pretty important as we move forward. And again, this map here is from the World Food Program, the situation in 2019. What we're going to spend a little bit of time on an overview is just thinking about global demand in terms of where is food demand going to be. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at global supply in terms of where that food is going to be produced. In terms of looking at this, one of the drivers of demand is certainly population. The more mouths there are to feed, certainly that's going to increase demand. The other thing that's going to be very important is income. The more income that the individuals have, they begin to diversify their diets. And in some respects, this creates different issues with regards to trade and moving the types of food that people would like to diversify into with regards to the food that they've had. This is one of the things that occurs around the globe is that as people have more income, they begin to diversify their diet. In the U.S., for example, we were originally very grain-based, very livestock protein-based. But as people have had more income, they produce more fruits and vegetables. They want to diversify their diet, both for health reasons, but just for variety. And so those are the two main drivers we'll talk about with regards to demand. Then we'll talk about supply. One of the aspects there is the land resources. We'll talk a little bit with regards to potential land resources. And then the other thing that is going to be very important is productivity. Productivity will provide an indication of how much food is being able to be produced. We've already looked at this a little bit, but this is essentially the population that is expected to occur from 1950 to 2050. One of the things you can see here is if you just go across the lines and then go down, you can essentially see how quickly we're adding 1 billion people to the population. Certainly, one of the things you see is that the amount of time that passes is tending to get less as time goes on. The other thing I think is very important is just to think about this from a perspective of different continents, different regions. For example, you have North America, and so in North America, you can kind of see the change in population over time. In terms of Europe, you can see that Europe, in some respects, has been fairly flat, and it's expected to decline a little bit over the next 30 years. One of the big changes is Africa. If you look at Africa, essentially a big increase in the amount of population. And as I indicated previously, essentially we're looking at adding a little bit more than 1 billion people in Africa over the next 30 years. And then we have Asia here. One of the things, the big population area, if we look up to 2020, essentially you're looking at about 4.7 billion people in Asia. You're looking at a little bit more than maybe 1.4 billion in Africa. And then the rest of the continents, whether or not it be Latin America, whether or not it be Asia, or whether or not it be Europe, whether or not it be the U.S. or North America, whether or not it be Oceania, less than 1 billion people are on those continents. I'll look a little bit more at Asia to give an indication of the population. And here, essentially, we kind of have Asia broken up. We have Western Asia that consists of Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman. We have South Central Asia that goes from Iran to Bangladesh. Then we have Southeast Asia, that would be Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, Philippines, Vietnam. And then we have Eastern Asia, which is going to be Mongolia, China, Japan, and North and South Korea. In terms of looking at this, we see that within Asia, there's still some major things occurring. One is the situation that within roughly 5 years, we will see India surpass China. And so the population in India will be greater than the population of China within roughly 5 years. Again, you can see that South Central Asia has surpassed Eastern Asia in terms of population. And you look at both China and Eastern Asia, the number of individuals expected to be in those regions is going to be less at that in 2050. You see Southeastern Asia, you see Western Asia, and you see growth in the 4 regions of Asia, except for Eastern Asia, where there will be an expected decrease in population. This certainly is a change from what has been occurring. So looking at this, global population is going to increase from roughly 7 billion to 9.8 billion by 2050. Roughly, we will have an increase in population by 28%. And so over the next 30 years, we're almost adding 1% per year with regards to this. Asia is going to increase by essentially 16%. And so increasing from 4.6 to 5.3 billion. And then Africa is going to essentially increase by 96%, 1.3 billion to 2.5 billion people. And then India is expected to overtake China as the most populated country in 2024. Those 2 countries alone, 1 in 3 people on the planet are located in those countries. And so that's going to be very important. Next, we'll look at income. Essentially what I have, and this is from the OECD, but this provides a little bit of an indication for different continents in terms of where they expect GDP to grow. If we look at this, we see that India is expected to have the highest growth of the countries that I've looked at here. China is expected to have pretty good growth over the period of time. And then we will end up with growth in income by the different countries. One of the things you look at this graph is it from 2018 forward. It doesn't seem like there's much variability. This is just an artifact of economic models. Economic models, when they forecast, a lot of times once they get very far out, they just end up forecasting from the trend. And so I think the variability, and we're seeing this even with the COVID response and how that's affecting the economic growth in many countries around the world, there's going to be a lot of variability going forward. And in some respects, that's going to be very important for people to think about as they move forward. And so essentially over the next 30, 31 years, we're going to see global per capita income. It's going to continue to increase even once we're through this pandemic here. It is expected that we will continue to have economic growth. A little bit is demand. And what I've done here is I've looked at different agricultural products and try to trace out some income effects. And so what I have here is I have the GDP per capita of different continents. And these are in constant 2010 dollars, so they're adjusted for inflation. Then what I have on this axis is the kilograms per capita per year consumed. This first slide basically looks at bovine, and so this would be any bovine consumption. In terms of looking at this, you have the Oceania region. Essentially, you have the North American region, and you have Europe. And in terms of looking at Europe, Oceania, and North America, essentially it looks pretty much that as people become wealthier, they actually are moving away from the consumption of bovine products. In some respects, each of these, no matter what period you look at, does seem to have a downward slope. This is a little bit different than South America that has a upward slope. And then if we look at Asia, there's an upward slope. And then in Africa, not much variability in income there, but what you end up seeing looking at the numbers is there is an upward sloping per capita consumption of bovine products. And so one of the things I think to recognize is that this may be an indication of taste and preferences, that as people become wealthier, they may begin to diversify their diet away from bovine products. If we look at this on pig meat, essentially fairly flat in the US, fairly flat in Europe. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with the data in Europe in terms of there shouldn't be such a jump in income there. But if you look at the more recent years, you do have a flat growth in demand. If you look at, for example, Oceania, very much of an upslope. If you look at Asia, very much of an upslope. If you look at South America, very much of an upslope. And if you look at Africa. And so one of the ways I think you can think about this is essentially pork consumption tends to max out on a per capita basis at about 30 kilograms per person per year. In terms of, you can see that there's several regions of the world that as they accumulate more income, they are increasing their consumption of pork. The next one we'll take a look at is poultry. And so this is poultry. One of the things you see here is that it doesn't appear that there's a leveling off. If you look at North America, if you look at Oceania, if you look at Europe, if you look at South America, if you look at Africa, if you look at Asia, all of those are very much sloping upwards. And so it appears that I'm not sure where the per capita consumption is going to be on poultry meat. But certainly that's one of the things that differs between poultry and pig meat and meat from cattle. The next slide here looks at egg consumption. And so again, this is the kilograms per capita per year. Again, it seems like there may be satiation points here. In terms of in the U.S., it looks like it flattens out pretty close to 14 kilograms per year. In Europe, it seems to flatten out at about 12 kilograms. In terms of Oceania, kind of was decreasing their egg consumption, but now that's changed. But then we look at developing countries in terms of Africa, Asia, and South America. You see that as people get more income, they add protein through that egg consumption. And we'll do one more of these. This is dairy products or milk consumption. This is kind of on a fluid milk basis, and so whether or not they're consuming cheese or butter or yogurt, essentially all of those products are put together on a per milk unit. And so they convert it back to the raw milk. Again, you see some satiation here, where essentially it appears that at some point the consumption levels off. And so you look at the continents that have less income, Africa, South America, Asia, they certainly see that an increasing amount. And so I think the important thing to realize from these is that there tends to be a very different response in different parts of the region. Generally, livestock products see increased per capita consumption in low-income regions of the world. And so as people get more and more wealth, they add protein to the diet. And so if you're in a country where income is increasing, one of the things you should expect is an increasing amount of livestock product consumption. In higher income countries, normally there appears to be a satiation point where it doesn't matter how much more income you get, essentially you come up with a steady consumption pattern there in terms of, for example, pork meat in the U.S., milk products, in terms of cattle is actually decreasing on the per capita consumption. But again, there does seem to be a shift away from beef in higher income regions with increased income. Again, there just seems to be more diversification in the diet with other proteins. And I think if we looked at this from fruit and vegetable consumption, I think you would see an increasing amount of that as incomes rise. In terms of looking forward, and this is a study from the FAO, it's a 2009 study. I wish it would be updated a little bit, but currently the most recent aspect is 2009. But essentially the important thing to realize is that by 2050, essentially the grain consumption is expected to go from 2.1 billion metric tons to 3.0. And so essentially looking at this, there's expected to be a fairly large increase in the demand for grain products. The second aspect there is livestock products, and this is expected to increase from 200 to 470 million metric tons. And so using the projections from the FAO, it's expected that the livestock products are expected to more than double over the next 30 years. Certainly, this is going to create demand and opportunities for different countries in order to step in that gap. The FAO indicates that 90% of that is going to be from increased productivity. And so the big issue here is that productivity is going to need to increase. And then the other thing that they estimate is we're going to have to add 120 million hectares. And so the question is, 120 million hectares looks like a large number from my perspective. And so we'll think about that. But one of the things you may want to think about right now is how many hectares of arable land are there in the world? In terms of, is this 120? It looks big, but is that a big number or not? In terms of looking at this, the answer is that essentially we're globally right about 1.4 billion hectares. And so you could take 120, divide that by 1.4 or 1,400, and that would say that our land base needs to increase by about 7%. And so certainly you can see that from the 1960s, pretty much up to the mid-1980s, the land base increased globally. Then essentially it decreased for a period of time. And then over the last decade or so, we've started to increase the amount of acreage that is there. If you want to think about where the arable land is, essentially these are the top 10 countries as of the most recent statistics, which are 2017. The U.S. has the most arable land, followed by India, the Russian Federation, China. There's a drop off to Brazil, Argentina, Canada, Nigeria, the Ukraine, and Pakistan. One of the things that's very important is Brazil. Brazil is basically 3 times the amount of land now than they were previously. And so in the 1950s, they were down about this area. Now they're up to 80 million hectares. And so a lot of the land that's coming in is Brazil. And another country that is increasing the arable land is Argentina. And we'll talk a little bit about that coming in. To give you an indication, these 10 countries are basically 3/5 or 59.5% of the arable land around the globe. Generally, the pattern is that arable land increased until 1986. Then it fell slightly through 2007, and then it increased slightly from there. One of the things to think about, we talked about the fact that we would need 7% more arable land. Well, over the last 70 years, we've added 9.2% arable land. And so over that period, what we have in 2020 or 2017 is about 9% bigger than what we had in 1961. In terms of right now, we're about 1.2% more than we had in 1986, and we're about 3.2% in 2007. The key thing is that there is the opportunity to add arable land. And one of the things that I looked at was just what is the possibility to add arable land around the globe. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates that essentially Brazil could bring in 145 to 170 million hectares. 10 million of this would be from the Amazon region. Certainly, in some respects, there's concern about the deforestation there. The way that this works is that if you're going to farm 1 acre in the Amazon region, you essentially need to have 5 hectares. And so it's a 1-to-5 ratio in terms of hectares. The other place that Brazil can bring in land is this Cerrado region, which is in the center of Brazil. Essentially, there it is if you're going to farm 1 acre, you have to purchase 2 hectares. And so there's a 1-to-2 ratio there. That is a policy that the government of Brazil has implicated in order to protect the environment. Then there's the conversion from pasture to arable land. There's an estimate of 70 to 90 million hectares that can be converted from cattle production, grass production to agricultural land. And there is a chance that this will occur, especially based on the price ratio. We've begun to see a little bit of that with regards to this. This pasture land is very much like what they're producing crops on, and so there's not a big difference there. Russia, essentially, there's 10 million hectares that were produced before 1992 that are no longer produced, and so certainly there's some possibilities there. The U.S., there's 12.5 million hectares that we've taken out of production, and so that could come in. The thing is you can begin to start looking at these and see that it is very possible that we could bring in 120 million hectares. And I haven't even talked about other regions such as Africa, such as parts of Central Asia. There's just lots of regions that could come in. The next aspect we'll talk about is productivity. And what this is this is the global wheat yield from 1961 to 2018. And so one of the things you'll see is that we are gaining more productivity. In 1960, the world was down between 7,000 and 13,000 hectograms per hectare, the production. If you look at where we are now, Europe has done very well. They're up to 40,000 hectograms per hectare. The Oceania region certainly hasn't increased as much. They're about 20,000. But again, you can see kind of the productivity. And looking at that over time, I've estimated these for different commodities. The world, since 1961 through 2014, has increased productivity about 2% per hectare on a year-by-year basis. Soybean, about 1.5, wheat, about 2%, rice, about 1.7. And then you can see livestock, where essentially we are getting more. You can also look at this with regards to different regions to get a difference. One of the big things here that you'll end up seeing is South America has really had high productivity growth. And in some commodities, Asia has had a pretty good high productivity group. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to focus on Kazakhstan. And so Kazakhstan will be part of the solution as Kazakhstan continues to develop their agricultural economy, and certainly there will be other Central Asia countries that will be part of the solution. But Kazakhstan does produce a number of items for export, and I'm going to focus on wheat mostly with regard to this. But this first graph here is the quantity of different products that Kazakhstan produces. These are in 2018. But essentially, in terms of metric tons, Kazakhstan produces 14,000 in terms of wheat. Then you look at milk, it's 5,000. Then we look at barley, potatoes, and then watermelons, linseed, other melons, maize, sunflower seed, and onions. But it does give a little bit of an indication of what Kazakhstan produces. But we are going to focus on wheat here to look at that. In terms of looking at what Kazakhstan exports, this is million US dollars. But essentially you can see that wheat exports are the number one export. Then you have flour, which again is very much of a wheat product. That's the number two export. Then barley, linseed, cigarettes, cotton lint, sunflower seeds, rapeseed, lentils, and then sunflower oil. In terms of agricultural products that are imported, and certainly this is one of the ways that perhaps Kazakhstan could change its economy, but one of the major imports is just food preparation. And so if there are ways to do more of that internal, then number two import is chocolate products. Chicken is the third import. Again, would there be a possibility for Kazakhstan to increase the amount of chicken production to essentially produce more of that domestically? Again, looking at demand, you see that as Kazakhstan increases in wealth and income per capita, it's likely that chicken is going to become more important. Then you have tea, raw sugar, cigarettes, sugar refined, pastry, crude food materials, and then cheese. And so that gives a little bit of the Kazakhstan aspect there. This next graph, just to help you think through this a little bit, this is the world wheat trade. And essentially, you can see that from 1961 to 2017, it's grown from about 40 million metric tons to about 190 million metric tons. And so there's more and more trade of wheat. This is the export side. We'll also look at this, but we can look at Kazakhstan's wheat exports since 1992. Essentially, you can see that there is a trend up with regards to the exports, but certainly there tends to be some variability. And so part of that, I'm sure, is the size of the crop that Kazakhstan produces, but certainly you can see that wheat exports have been increasing over time. In terms of looking at the global market, and this is the importers. These are the countries, the top 10 countries that import wheat. Indonesia is number one. They import 5.5% of the world's wheat that is traded. Egypt is number two, Algeria number three, Italy number four, Bangladesh 5, Spain 6, Brazil 7, Japan 8, Nigeria 9, and Philippines 10. The top 5 countries basically buy 22.5% of the world's wheat, and the top 10 countries buy 38%. Wheat is a very dispersed market. And so in order to trade with different countries, you have to have negotiations and agreements with many different countries. One of the things that's noticeably absent here is China. China really is not a major purchaser of the world's wheat. If you look at soybeans or other commodities, China would be in a very different place. And then if we look at the top exporters, the top 5 exporters basically export 62% of the wheat, and the top 10 is 85% of the world's wheat. And so if you look at this, the Russian Federation is the world's leading wheat export, at least in 2017, where they exported 17%. US basically was 14%. Then you have Australia or Canada, Australia, both at 11.2%. And then Ukraine, 8.8%, France, Argentina, Germany, Romania, and then Kazakhstan that exported 2.2% of the world's wheat. One last slide we'll look, and then I think we'll open it up for questions. This gives a little bit of an indication of the percentage of Kazakhstan's wheat production that's exported. And so look at this, and essentially it seems to kind of be about 30% of Kazakhstan wheat is exported. Certainly there's years that are higher, certainly there's years that are lower, but certainly there are variability in those wheats in the wheat export on a global basis. So maybe to end here, certainly the global food and egg sector is going to have to step up to feed an additional 2 billion people. In some regions of the world, it's probably going to be difficult to produce the amount of food demanded. I think Africa is going to struggle to produce the amount of food necessary to feed their population. I think some regions within Asia might struggle a little bit. Globally, and I have some information that globally, I think we're going to be able to do it. If you look at those productivity figures that I gave you and kind of look at that over time, I think there is the possibility, a very strong possibility, that food production will continue to increase. We will tend to be more productive using science and technology. But the big thing I think is going to be is there's going to be more of a reliance on matching supply and demand. A lot of the food that's going to be produced is going to be produced in regions where the per capita population is fairly low. And so that food will need to be transported to where the people are. And so if you look at the global situation over the next 30 years or over the next 80 years, you're going to see a mismatch in terms of where the population is going to end up on the planet and where the production is. Certainly, Russia and Kazakhstan and some of the former Soviet Union countries are going to have opportunities to produce more and essentially export. And then certainly the Western Hemisphere, both the Brazil, Argentina, and the U.S., Canada, Mexico will also be a supply. But essentially the big thing is that mismatch between supply and demand that I think is really going to be an issue going forward. And I think that's going to be very important to look at this. Certainly there's political aspects to trade, and the other way you can essentially solve the mismatch is through immigration. And it appears that most political governments prefer trade to immigration. But there is that mismatch that we're going to face going forward that's really going to be important to think about going on. One of the things, certainly Kazakhstan and some of the other regions are going to be part of the solution. And so some of the former Soviet countries are going to be very important. You see that in the wheat market, Russia and Ukraine are very important. Kazakhstan is very important. And so I think the ability to produce food in your part of the world is going to be very important as we move forward. So with that, I think we have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. And so I would be willing to take questions.
Уважаемые участники, сейчас открыто время для дискуссии. Получается, у нас есть где-то 10 минут для дискуссии. Если есть вопросы, можете задавать. Благодарю.
Вопросы мистеру Физерстоуну можно задать как на русском, так и на английском языке.
Okay, this is Michael Brody. I have a question, if nobody else does. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. So when we are starting to look at and think about 30-year projections on agricultural productivity, are some of these analyses taking into account climate change, and which is 30 years and out in Central Asia, of course, there's the big water resource issue. Может быть, я могу перевести. Участники, я спросила в вопросе изменения климата и как отношение с предсказанием, как сказать, продуктивность сельского хозяйства.
Certainly, when you look at those projections, the ability to adapt to climate is going to be very important. There's going to be obviously water issues in different parts of the region in the world. One of the things I think is that Kazakhstan does have some irrigated agriculture. I'm trying to look up really quickly how much, essentially 20,000 square kilometers as of 2020 in terms of irrigated agriculture. There is becoming technology that will make much more efficient use of water, whether or not that be through some type of terrain irrigation. Certainly the way we apply water will be much different. But also in terms of, there's a lot of breeding going on with regards to selecting varieties that can produce more with less water. One of the things that we have going on at Kansas State University is we have a kind of a wheat genomics project. It's kind of a Feed the Future lab that essentially what they're looking at is they're using techniques that were developed in biotechnology and using some of those techniques to look at the DNA of each of the wheat products and essentially to understand the traits that are naturally occurring in the plant that will essentially make a wheat plant more efficient in terms of water use. And so with kind of what's going on from a genomic perspective, I think there will be a way to naturally select through natural breeding programs to essentially make that plant more efficient. And so the world, I don't believe, has really touched any of the genomic research and opportunities that are there. To give another example of what technology can do, and this isn't in terms of meeting the quantity, but it could be meeting the quality, is they have identified the 3 or 4 markers in the wheat plant, the wheat genome, that basically causes celiac disease. And so the thought is there a way to naturally shut that manifestation of the plant off such that there isn't the issue with celiac disease and gluten. And so I think there's a lot on the forefront that will make us much more efficient from a plant perspective, but also from a cultural practice in terms of how we raise crops. And so I tend to be pretty optimistic that we will be able to overcome those overcome some of those barriers and aspects of climate change with the technology. And it could be on gene splicing, but I know different countries have different views with regards to using biotech to do that. And so there's also a way you can do it just through natural breeding programs by essentially selecting the right products to cross. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that answer.
Hello, can I ask?
Yes.
First of all, I want to say that you have a really good demonstration of statics and competent speech. I really like it. I'm glad that you see the prospects in Kazakhstan, and my question is how to attract youth to these problems, for example, to right conception of the everything they eat or do, the right conception of everything, how to attract the youth of the world.
Yeah, in terms of that's a very good question. In terms of some of this requires technology, but there are ways that countries cooperate on technology. Certainly in the food system, it tends to be very open with regards to transferring science, transferring technology. The other thing that can be an issue is capital, and that sometimes becomes a little bit more important. But again, I think one of Kazakhstan's goals is to diversify their country in terms of the economy, and essentially, I think that diversification will be good for the agricultural sector, simply because it does, that diversification does attract more capital, more technology into the country, both from a non-agricultural perspective, but also from an agricultural perspective. And so certainly I think that diversification of Kazakhstan's economy is going to be very, very important.
Answer.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
First of all, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting for us. I'm from Armenian National Agrarian University. By the way, we have the Texas A&M branch here in Armenia. It's called Armenian Teaching Center.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is about how to attract the farmers to use the lands. We have 1/3 of arable lands that are not used in Armenia. And also we have a self-sufficiency problem about the wheat. Again, 31% of wheat self-sufficiency is 31%. We can produce only 31% of wheat for to supply for our demand. So how to attract the farmers? How do you think attract farmers to use the lands? They don't want, because we have not good conditions to do agriculture here. Thank you very much.
Okay. And those are different issues that different countries to work through. In terms of part of it is through some type of an extension type program. That's one of the ways that I think U.S. agriculture developed, and certainly extension programs look differently for different countries across the world, but some of it's just education. And one of the things that we had used over time, and we still do, is We have demonstration plots that the university does across the country, and maybe Armenia already does this, but essentially, they essentially buy a small parcel of land or get rights to a small parcel of land to be able to do some demonstrations, and then they'll do education type programs with that. And so sometimes it's just an educational process to look at that. I think the other thing that you brought up is the whole issue of self-sufficiency. And I think that becomes pretty important to think through with regards to whether or not self-sufficiency for an individual country is important, or whether or not self-sufficiency for a region is important. In the U.S., because we're such a large country, we do a lot of trade within the region, and so we take advantage of comparative advantage. And so that's one of the ways I think that we look at that. But certainly there has to be trust through countries in order to do that trade among different regions. But that is, in some respects, an issue just with the geography within that. And that's certainly what the European Union had tried to do with creating all these countries into one trade union where they can move product from country to country and essentially take advantage of comparative advantage. But I don't know a lot about your country, so it's always dangerous to talk off the top of my head when I have such little knowledge, but those would be some of my initial thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Is there any questions from Uzbekistan? Was 2 questions, please ask.
Thank you for excellent presentation. I'm sorry. And do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
And thank you. And how do you think about pandemic? How pandemic will influence to food safety of regions? With production, without agriculture, more about your opinions. How do you think?
Yes. In terms of the pandemic, has had a major influence on agriculture worldwide, maybe more so in developed countries and maybe some of the developing countries, but certainly trade flows have been affected. Also, for example, if you use a very concentrated meat packing system, we've had probably 3 or 4 or 5 major meat packers that individuals have gotten sick and they've had to shut down the plant. In terms of one of the things I think that a number of individuals are thinking about is it's probably going to be more use of robotics to produce food. And so instead of having people do it, I think we'll see more robotics in the food supply chain where you're not relying on humans that are susceptible to being sick. To give a little bit of an example in terms of Frito-Lay, which is a potato chip manufacturing plant, they essentially replaced the individuals that were scanning the potatoes for the appropriate quality with optical sensors and other types of technology to essentially choose the potatoes that they want to process versus those that are not of quality to process. And so I think longer term, I think we're going to see more technology where humans are less important, at least doing the manual labor. But in some respects, with the shutdown of the economy, agriculture is relatively positioned simply because people still need to eat. And at least what we've seen in many countries worldwide is those that sell food through grocery stores. Those grocery stores have actually increased their profitability. Probably the big thing that's unknown is the amount of food consumption that is not consumed at home. People like to go to restaurants to have food with friends and family, and it'll be very interesting to see how that changes. The U.S., roughly 50% of the food is consumed away from home, 50% is consumed at home, and so the supply chains completely needed to change to produce that almost 100% of consumption at home because of the closing of restaurants. And so that, I think, is really going to be interesting. And certainly there's parts of the world that consume a lot more of their food away from home in restaurants than the U.S. does. And so it'll be very interesting to see how that occurs. One of the things that would be a positive for countries that produce wheat is that we've actually noticed a fairly large change in the consumption of wheat and wheat flour as people are doing more cooking at home in various parts of the world. A lot more people are consuming bread than other types of food. And so I think the most unknown thing is just going to be how societies react to the food that they previously consumed in restaurants. And I don't have a good prediction on that, whether or not people will feel safe in 6 months or a couple years to go back to consuming food in restaurants, or whether or not the pandemic will change the way that they consume food for the long term. That's really an unknown question at this point in time.
Thank you.
More questions, please? So there was one question by the Alihan Karimova. So the question is, what can you say about Uzbek agricultural products and their exports?
Could you repeat that? I missed a couple words.
What can you say about Uzbek agricultural products and their exports? This is a question by Alihan Karimova.
At this point, I can't really say anything at this point. I could look it up from where I get my statistics, but I'm unfamiliar enough with Uzbekistan that it would be, I would not have a good answer. So sorry about that in terms of...
Thank you.
Okay. Professor Alan Featherstone, thank you very much for so interesting lecture. We have opportunity to listen a lot of information, very new and actual for this time. And as I told you before, I hope to see you in Almaty next year. I mean, next summer school. Thank
No.
you.
That would be good. Thank you.
Okay. Now is our lecture is finished. Thank you very much for everybody who participate and for Professor once again.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
So you'll hear more from me.
Okay. That'll be good.
Thank you, Saulia. Спасибо всем.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much for
Спасибо.
your talk, wonderful talk. I'm from Spain, Maria Luisa Lopez.
Thank you, Professor. This were thank you.
Ничего не нажимал. Запись продолжается.